Mr. Speaker, if I was in jail in Iran for a crime I didn't commit, I have to say I couldn't hope for a better Member of Parliament than my honourable friend, the Member for Hampstead and Kilburn. I hope that the Foreign Secretary will pay tribute to her. Mr. Ratcliffe has close family in my constituency, including a former well-respected Lord Mayor of Chester. So when the Foreign Secretary goes to Iran, will he undertake to take a delegation of members of this House with him who have a constituency interest, which would surely include, of course, my honourable friend from Hampstead and Kilburn?
Secretary.
If I may, I don't want to disappoint the honourable member who's a close follower of these issues. And I join him in paying tribute, by the way, to the work of the honourable lady, because she has been assiduous, and I was very glad to have a meeting with her the other day. I cannot guarantee at this stage that we will have such a delegation. I think one thing at a time, if I may say.
Thank you. Order. Statement. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Secretary David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll update the House on negotiations between the United Kingdom and the European Union in November, reflecting our actions since the October Council. Both the United Kingdom and the European Union recognise a new dynamic instilled in the talks by the Prime Minister's Florence speech. At the October European Council, 27 Member States responded by agreeing to start their preparations for moving the negotiations onto trade and the future relationship we want to see. And the Council conclusions also call for work to continue with a view to being able to move to the second phase of negotiations as soon as possible. It is, of course, inevitable that discussions are now narrowing to a few outstanding, albeit important, issues that remain. Last week, our focus was concentrated on finding solutions to those few remaining issues. As we move forward towards December Council, we've been clear with the European Union that we're willing to engage in discussions in a flexible and constructive way in order to achieve the progress needed. To this end, our teams are in continuous contact, even between formal rounds. I'll now turn to the three key ongoing areas of discussion and outline progress made last week in each of these. Now, we've made solid progress on our ongoing discussions on Northern Ireland and Ireland. Key areas of achievement include continued progress in technical discussions on preserving North-South cooperation, agreed joint principles on the continuation of the common travel area and associated rights, and drafting further joint principles on how best we preserve North-South cooperation under the Belfast Agreement to help guide specific solutions to unique circumstances in Northern Ireland. Both sides also remain firmly committed to avoiding a hard border, a point we've remained clear on throughout. We also remain resolutely committed to upholding the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in all its parts, and to finding a solution that works for the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland. We've continued to hold frank discussions with our Commission counterparts about all these issues. But in this area, we've also had to be very clear with our Commission counterparts that whilst we respect their desire to protect the legal order of the single market and the customs union, that cannot come at the cost of the constitutional or economic integrity of the United Kingdom. As I've said, we cannot create a new border within the United Kingdom. This is an area where we believe we'll only be able to conclude talks finally in the context of a future relationship. Until such time as we do so, we need to approach the issues which arise with a high degree of political sensitivity, with pragmatism and with creativity. Discussions on these areas will continue in the run-up to the December Council. Now, we continue to make good progress on citizens' rights. Both sides are working hard towards resolution of outstanding issues. Last week, to respond to the request for reassurances by the European Union, we published a detailed description of our proposed administrative procedures for European Union citizens seeking settled status in the United Kingdom. As our paper demonstrates, the new procedures will be as streamlined, straightforward and low cost as possible. They'll be based on simple, transparent criteria, and these criteria will be laid out in the withdrawal agreement. While there remain differences on the issues of family reunion and the export of benefits, we've been clear that we're willing to consider what further reassurance we can provide to existing families of EU residents here, even if they're not currently living together in the United Kingdom. I believe this paves the way to resolving the remaining issues in this area, and this was acknowledged by the Commission on Friday. There remain some areas also where we're still seeking further movement from the European Union on issues such as voting rights, mutual recognition of qualifications, and onward movement for British citizens currently living in the EU 27. In all these three areas, the United Kingdom's offer goes beyond that of the European Union. Finally, the Commission has not yet matched the UK's offer in relation to the right to stand and vote in local elections. Now, this is a core citizens' right, nominally enshrined in the European Union treaties. And I've been disappointed the European Union has been unwilling to include voting rights in the withdrawal agreement so far. As a result, we will pursue this issue bilaterally with Member States. This week we've also sought to give further clarity on our commitment to incorporate the agreement we reach on citizens' rights into UK law. This will ensure that European Union citizens of the UK can directly enforce their rights in UK courts, providing certainty and clarity for the long term. We've made it clear that over time our courts can take account of the rulings of the European Court of Justice in this area to help ensure consistent interpretation. However, we remain clear that as we leave the European Union, it's a key priority for the United Kingdom to preserve the sovereignty of our courts, and as such, in leaving the European Union, we'll bring to an end the direct jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Mr. Speaker, it's not my intention to preempt the committee stage of the EU withdrawal bill, but what I say next does have some relevance for it. It's clear that we need to take further steps to provide clarity and certainty, both in the negotiations and at home, regarding the implementation of any agreement into United Kingdom law. I can now confirm that once we've reached an agreement, we will bring forward a specific piece of primary legislation to implement that agreement. This will be known as a Withdrawal Agreement and Implementation Bill. This confirms that the major policies set out in the Withdrawal Agreement will be directly implemented into UK law by primary legislation, not by secondary legislation under the Withdrawal Bill. This also means that Parliament will be given time to debate, scrutinise and vote on the final agreement we strike with the European Union. This agreement will only hold if Parliament approves it. We expect this bill to cover the contents of the Withdrawal Agreement. That includes issues such as an agreement on citizens' rights, any financial settlement, and the details on implementation period agreed between both sides. Of course, we do not yet know the exact details of this bill and are unlikely to do so until the negotiations are near completion. I should also tell the House that this will be over and above the undertaking we've already made that we'll bring forward a motion on the final deal as soon as possible after the deal is agreed, and that we still intend and expect for such a vote on the final deal to happen before the European Parliament votes on it. There cannot be any doubt that Parliament will be intimately involved at every stage. Finally, on the financial settlement, well, I see laughter from the benches opposite. Actually, this has been called for by members on all sides of this House. So I'd actually hope that we get Labour Party support for it, for once. Now, finally, on the financial settlement. The Prime Minister's commitment made in her Florence speech stands. Our European partners will not need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current budget plan as a result of our decision to leave. The UK will honour its commitments we've made during the period of our membership, and this week we made substantial technical progress on the issues which underpin those commitments. So there's been a low-key but important technical set of negotiations, falling as it does between two European councils. This is now about pinpointing further technical discussions that need to take place and moving forward into the political discussions and political decisions. We must now also look ahead to moving our discussions onto our future relationship. For this to happen, both parties need to build confidence in both the process and indeed the shared outcome. The United Kingdom will continue to engage and negotiate constructively as we have done since the start. But we need to see flexibility, imagination and willingness to make progress on both sides if these negotiations are to succeed and we are able to realise our new partnership. I commend this statement to the House, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for advance notice of his statement. It's clearly a statement of two halves, Mr. Speaker. First, the usual Groundhog Day report back on the negotiations in Brussels. A round of negotiations, a press conference at the end that leaves us wondering whether the parties were in the same negotiations, then both sides briefing the press in the days immediately afterwards, then a statement from the dispatch box that assures no one. Underlying this, a profound lack of progress. We want the next statement, Mr. Speaker, to be different. We want the Secretary of State to return and inform the House that real progress has been made, a breakthrough even. Last time we were promised acceleration. What now? And what's the plan if the December deadline is missed? Now, Mr. Speaker, I do recognise some of the difficulties, and as the Secretary of State knows, I have some sympathy with the position on Northern Ireland that he has set out. As we see from the legislation before this House today, the political situation in Northern Ireland is fragile. The peace process is too precious to be put at risk by rushing a Brexit deal that doesn't have the support of all communities. There must be no return to a hard border. And, Mr. Speaker, Northern Ireland should not be used by either side in the negotiations for political point scoring, and I think that's a really important point in this House. The second half of the statement is not a report back at all. It's a recognition by the government that it's about to lose a series of votes on the withdrawal bill. Labour has repeatedly argued, since the bill was first published in July, that the Article 50 deal required primary legislation, including a vote of this House, a point that was made forcefully at second reading. Now, on the eve of crucial amendments, we have this statement under the cloak of a report back from Brussels. I don't think that fools anyone. The devil will no doubt be in the detail. But can the Secretary of State now confirm the government accepts Labour's argument that Clause 9 should now be struck from the withdrawal bill altogether? And then there's the question of transitional arrangements. Mr. Speaker, it's blindingly obvious to anybody following these negotiations that a final deal with the EU, including a trade agreement, will not be completed by March 2019, and that transitional agreements on the same terms as now are in the public interest. That's what businesses want, it's what communities want, it's what Labour's been calling for many, many months. So can the Secretary of State confirm, on the back of the statement he's just made, that the government will not stand in the way of sensible transitional arrangements on the same basic terms as we have now with the EU? Can the Secretary of State also confirm the government will not now be pushing amendments inconsistent with transitional arrangements? And can the Secretary of State confirm to this House that this House will get a vote in the event that there is no deal? Mr. Speaker, these questions have been pressing for months. This last-minute attempt to climb down brings them into very sharp focus, and we're entitled to clear answers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yet more carping opposite from the right honourable gentleman. He complains the negotiations aren't making as much progress as he'd like. Yet he allowed his Labour members of the European Parliament to vote against progress this time around. Yeah? The question he needs to ask himself is what would he be prepared to sacrifice in order to buy the goodwill of the European Commission? You know, we are standing up for the UK citizens to move around Europe, to use their professional qualifications to vote in municipal elections. Is he seriously proposing we let them down in the interest of suddenly rushing ahead? We're standing up for British taxpayers and we're not wasting their money, with a clear position that we'll meet our financial commitments, but only once we know more about our future relationship. Would he sell them? Would he sell them out? Yep. Yeah? We're using Brexit to restore the sovereignty of the British courts. Would he let that go too? Yes, he would, because he'd give the European Court of Justice the right to dictate our laws in perpetuity. So let me come back to his description. The second half, he says, does not arise from the negotiation. Well, yes, it does, because actually one of the reasons for this bill that I've announced today is providing to European citizens a primary piece of legislation which will put into British law the withdrawal agreement in toto. So it's as near as we can come to direct effect. It comes directly out of the negotiation today, and I hope next time I come to report this House we'll get a little bit more support from the Labour Party.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, we'll be debating tomorrow, I think, a rather unhelpful new clause first announced in the Daily Telegraph, which bears on the timing of all these processes. But can I get my right honourable friend to give the government's intentions on these final processes and the role of Parliament? Can he give me a reassurance that Parliament will have a legally binding, meaningful vote in which it will approve or disapprove of any final agreement or lack of agreement before we leave the European Union, and that there will be time, in whatever circumstances, for the necessary legislation to be introduced and debated to pass to implement in law smoothly and properly whatever it is Parliament has approved once the government's made its proposals.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that, my right honourable friend for that question. Firstly, yes, we will have a meaningful vote. It's been said from this dispatch box any number of times. But what I've been saying today is we're going to add to that, over and above the meaningful vote on the outcome, on the bill, on the deal, we'll have legislation which puts it into effect. In other words, the House will be able to go through it line by line and agree it line by line.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Turning first of all to Northern Ireland, does the Secretary of State not appreciate, it's becoming increasingly clear, the only sensible solution in Northern Ireland is for Northern Ireland to remain in the customs union? And if that means that the rest of us remain in the customs union as well, then that must be what we do. Because he has already said there cannot be a border between the two parts of Ireland, there cannot be a border between Northern Ireland and the mainland UK, nor can there be a border between the Republic of Ireland and the European Union. So there cannot be a customs border anywhere between the UK and the European mainland without breaching important international treaties. On citizens' rights, I welcome the Secretary of State's update on progress, but does not accept that we are now well past the time when our constituents are entitled to absolute legal guarantees that progress reports are not enough. The people are still leaving our businesses, our health service, our social care services because they don't have confidence that there will be a deal in time for them to make their future here. Can I turn next to the update we've had on the financial settlement? Would it be cynical to suggest that this will become a lot simpler when the Chancellor has got his budget out of the way? Can the Secretary of State tell us what discussions he's had with the Chancellor about what might need to be in the budget next week in order to pave the way for a financial settlement in the weeks to come? Or is it the case that the reason there will be no financial settlement in the budget is because the government know they could not get the budget past their own backbenchers if there's an admission of any contribution to the European Union included in that? And finally, coming to the announcement of a new piece of legislation, the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. First of all, can I give credit where it's due? The Secretary of State has done the right thing by announcing this to the House. Some of his Cabinet colleagues could well learn from that example. Can he give us more clarity as to what that bill will be about? I know he can't give us a detail, but when can we expect it to be published? Will it still simply be a question of take it or leave it, their deal or no deal? Will the House be given the opportunity to amend that bill, as the House must have the opportunity to amend any bill, and therefore will the House have the opportunity to attempt to amend the agreement? And given that the Prime Minister is now only 8 disgruntled Conservatives away from facing a vote of no confidence, why should anyone else have confidence in this government to extricate us from the mess they've created when they're rapidly losing the confidence of their own backbenchers?
Secretary of State.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions. Firstly, on the question of Northern Ireland, what I've said in terms, which is what I said here, is that there will be no internal border within the United Kingdom. That is an absolute fundamental, because, apart from anything else, the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, requires us to run the government, or the government of Northern Ireland, to operate on behalf of all communities, and at least one community in Northern Ireland would not accept a border in the Irish Sea. As for the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, everybody's accepted there must be no return to a hard border. Now, some of that is dealt with by the continuation of the common travel area, which has been around since 1923. So in that respect, that's not new. And in terms of the customs border, there is, of course, already a difference between levy and tax rates and excise rates north and south of the border, which we manage without a hard border, and that's what we'll continue to do. In terms of the budget, he's very optimistic if he thinks the Chancellor gives any of us advance warning of more than a week of his budget. Of course, I have discussed with him the financial aspects of our relationship with the European Union in many meetings. And as for the new legislation, well, of course, I don't think it's in the gift of the government to put a piece of primary legislation before the House which is incapable of amendment. It's the nature of primary legislation. It's always capable of amendment. Of course, we will have the practical limitations of having a deal we've signed, and there may be implications for that, but the whole thing will be put in front of the House.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, may I congratulate my right honourable friend in being very clear in his statement that come March the 29th, 2019, as we leave the European Union, the Court of Justice itself will no longer have authority, direct authority here in the United Kingdom, thus dispelling the games being played out by the opposition at the moment, as we heard this morning. But given that, may I just take my right honourable friend back to the statement he's made with regards to the bill and the motion. And as I understand it, if we had a motion that was voted on but was not passed, then that would negate the idea of a bill that would then could be amended. And if there was a bill and it was amended, as we were always told through the negotiations with Maastricht and beyond, you cannot accept an amendment at the end of the day because the agreement has already been made and thus you would be altering the agreement. Does that not lead us into the situation of maybe having a bill that changes the agreement but that the other side does not wish to make those changes?
Well, with respect to the first half of his question, if the motion that's the original motion that's put is not passed, the deal falls. Full stop, in toto. He's quite right about the second part, but he will remember the Maastricht Bill. As I remember it, there were quite a lot of amendments and quite a lot of voting on it. So the House is able to express its view, but it did so in the light of the consequences.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement that there will be primary legislation to implement EU withdrawal agreement. I would say, Mr. Speaker, it is another recognition of the government having to listen to the House of Commons. The question I want to ask is about Northern Ireland, because it is becoming increasingly clear that there is a contradiction between, on the one hand, the government's clearly stated desire that there should be no return to a hard border, no customs border, on the one hand, and its determination to leave the customs union and the single market. Now, since the proposals it has put forward to try and square that circle have so far failed to persuade the government of the Republic of Ireland that a hard border can be achieved, what does the government now propose to do about what is, after all, one of its central negotiating objectives?
Can I start by thanking him for his opening comments. At the time we published the white paper on what was then the Great Repeal Bill, now the Withdrawal Bill, I said at the time that we would listen to the House of Commons. Indeed, I said to the front bench opposite that specifically if there are any rights removed, then we would endeavour to replace them, and any other changes similarly. Now, in terms of Northern Ireland, the circumstance at the moment we face is that there are a range of permutations of possibilities depending on what the outcome is with respect to a free trade agreement and a customs agreement. If the government achieves its primary policy of having a tariff-free, barrier-free free trade agreement, then a customs agreement following on from that will be a very light-touch customs agreement, in which case it will be relatively straightforward to maintain a relatively invisible border. If that is not the case, I suspect the alternatives would be expensive but not impossible.
Mr. Rowan Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the House of Commons votes down the new withdrawal bill, will the consequence be that we will still leave on the 29th of March 2019, but without an agreement?
Yes.
What was that? The Secretary of State said yes. Kate Hoey.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Secretary of State's very firm rebuttal of the ridiculous idea that Northern Ireland would be taken out of the rest of the United Kingdom and stay in a customs union single. Can I also say that does he recognise also that the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee met recently with the head of customs in Switzerland, of course, who are not in the EU, and the one thing that he said over and over again, there is nothing that this cannot make this work if there is full cooperation between all sides. And isn't that what this is really about? The Republic of Ireland wants to have no customs union, no EU, no border, hard border. This can happen.
The Honourable Lady Member for Vauxhall is exactly right. This is true across the board. Whether you're talking about a free trade agreement, which we're told, oh, it's impossible in a time. The past Commissioner for Trade for the European Union, Karel de Gucht, said, no, it's not, if the political will is there. And the same is true in this case. If the political will is there, this can be done. And I am quite sure that the political will is there, north and south of that border.
So then cash.
Would the Secretary of State confirm that any such withdrawal bill would take place after the withdrawal bill itself has been enacted? In other words, after the 29th of March 2019?
No, I don't quite confirm that. This will depend on when the withdrawal treaty, as it were, or the withdrawal treaty is negotiated, and that is the intention of the Union to try to negotiate that by October of next year. So it's on the ideal outcome, it'll be before the conclusion. Yeah.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the government coming forward with a separate bill for the withdrawal agreement? Is something that I had laid amendments for, and the member for Beaconsfield had laid amendments on as well. But can you clarify the timing on this? He just said that it was only in an ideal world that this withdrawal agreement bill would come before Brexit Day. Can I say to him, there is a real problem if the government thinks they can simply use Clause 9 to provisionally implement a withdrawal agreement through secondary legislation whilst not having the withdrawal agreement bill until after Brexit Day. Can he clarify, will he confirm the government will bring the withdrawal agreement bill before the House before Brexit Day and not after?
The right honourable lady quite rightly corrects me for misspeaking slightly. Ideal, perhaps the wrong word. The right word is our principal policy aim. That's what we're trying to do. But what I can't guarantee is if the Union doesn't come to a conclusion in negotiations, we can't actually bring the withdrawal bill in front of the House before we have a withdrawal agreement. That's the sequence I'm pointing to.
Anna Soubry.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's all very interesting because, as you know, Mr. Speaker, the government's now decided to bring forward an amendment to put in law the Brexit leaving date, even though it's not been to the Cabinet and it's not been subject to the usual write-around. Could my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, help us with this? He's told us about this new piece of legislation that will come forward, which we can all vote on and amend and so on and so forth in the normal way. Well, that is only if there is an agreement. Can he confirm that in the event of no agreement, no deal, this place will have no say and we will leave on that date, because it's on the face of the bill, without any say from this supposedly sovereign Parliament which voted to take back control?
What I can say to her is that if we don't have a withdrawal agreement, we can't have a withdrawal agreement bill. Full stop.
Christopher Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, hasn't he just given the game away of what a sham offer this is? Totally worthless to Parliament, essentially trying to buy off people by saying, oh, look, we're going to give you an act to shape things, when in fact this is a post hoc, after the horse has bolted piece of legislation. We might have left the European Union, the treaty and the deal would have been done, and Parliament could do nothing at all to shape the nature of that withdrawal agreement. He has to do much better than this. Parliament must have a say on that withdrawal agreement before we are thrown over the cliff edge.
Let me repeat to him the probable sequence of events. If Mr. Barnier hits his target and I hit mine, we will conclude the withdrawal agreement and associated agreements in the latter part of next year. He's aiming for October next year. That's his stated aim. If we do that, then the withdrawal and treaty vote will come to the House, the simple in-principle vote. Then, as soon as possible thereafter, the withdrawal agreement bill will come in front of the House. That's the sequence, and that will be plenty of time, and it'll be able to amend it at the time.
Sir Edward Lee.
Imagine the outrage there would be in Europe if the European Union decided to try and detach Catalonia from Spain. But what is the European Union doing today? They are saying that they're going to detach Northern Ireland from the single market and customs union of the United Kingdom. Will my right honourable friend say this? The Conservative Party is nothing if it is not the Unionist Party. There will be no amendment, no track, no surrender, no appeasement on keeping Northern Ireland in the single market of the United Kingdom.
I say to my honourable friend and neighbour, I think I've made that plain, that we will not have any new borders within the United Kingdom.
Ben Bradshaw.
Clear, Mr. Speaker. Is he accepting the amendment in the name of the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield, or is he asking the House to take it on assurance from the dispatch box?
I'm stating what is government policy from the dispatch box.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I obviously greatly welcome my right honourable friend's statement in respect of there being a statute in order for us to implement the final deal. But it must be right that if that's the case, then unless my amendment were to be now accepted, Clause 9 becomes redundant. And I don't see how it's acceptable that we should implement Brexit by means of Clause 9 to have a statute after the date of our departure. And my anxieties are greatly heightened on this by the extraordinary amendment tabled by the government on Friday. Surely the answer is that if we run out of time, none of the suggestions that have now been put forward is that the time has to be extended under Article 50 so that all parties are able to deal with it. That's the mechanism that's provided, and surely that's the mechanism which the House and the government should be following.
I thank my right honourable friend for his welcome of the bill. But I say to him that Article 50, the extension of Article 50 can only be done by unanimity, and that's his weakness of it.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but this doesn't make any sense. The Secretary of State has said on any number of occasions that a deal could be done right at the last moment. So for the reasons just explained, can he be clear? He can't have that position that a deal could be done right at the last moment and support this new clause from the government nailing down the specific date.
Well, if I may say so, firstly, any number of occasions was one occasion in front of the Select Committee when I was asked that explicit question, what could happen to the negotiation in extremis. And since I was pointing to previous examples, it's hardly a statement of either intent or expectation. It certainly isn't. As for the rest of the honourable lady's question, I think it's pretty straightforward. We are aiming to hit October. Mr. Barnier is aiming to hit October. I hope we both do, but certainly I hope we hit the target of being well before the departure date. And the reason for that entry on the bill, the amendment to the bill, is that reflects what European law tells you.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Is there any prospect of the excellent Sir James Dyson being invited to join our splendid team of negotiators?
To join what? Well, I have spoken to Sir James Dyson. I don't necessarily agree with his how can I say, his tactical advice, but I have to say he is a brilliant exponent of what a great success this country can be when its engineers get stuck into the job.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State clarify what the government thinking is around an adjudication court, as mentioned this morning on Radio 4 by the honourable member of Chingford and Woodford Green?
Adjudication.
It doesn't.
Well, I'm afraid I didn't hear. Yes, I'm sure it was a brilliant exposition, but I didn't hear it.
But he's got the confirmation from the right honourable gentleman wittering from a secretary position that it was very good, and he said it not once but twice. That should satisfy the Secretary of State, I feel sure. Mr. Bernard Jenkin.
Could I invite my right honourable friend to just remind this House that 498 honourable and right honourable members voted for the withdrawal bill. And they, in the full knowledge that 2 years after notification had been served, we would be leaving the European Union. And isn't it a little disappointing that they seem to be backtracking on their commitment to honour their promises to the British people?
My honourable friend makes his point clearly. The simple fact is everybody has known March 2019 is departure date ever since the Article 50 bill was passed.
Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's retreat today in the face of impending votes on the withdrawal bill. But why is he intent on holding a gun to this House's head by presenting us with a choice only between the deal he negotiates and no deal at all? Right. Surely a meaningful vote and meaningful legislation would give this House the possibility of asking the government to go back and amend the deal, including, if necessary, as the honourable member for Beaconsfield has said, extending the timetable if that's what's required.
Nobody is holding a gun to the House's head, but what I will say to the honourable gentleman is that the decision being put before the House was put there by 17.5 million voters.
Sir Oliver Letwin.
Mr. Speaker, can my right honourable friend reassure those of us who increasingly believe that the strongest chance of ever achieving a deal is to be able to demonstrate to our EU counterparts that we are capable of managing exit without a deal, that he will shortly publish a comprehensive and convincing account of how this country will manage affairs in the absence of any deal whatsoever?
What I've said to the House many times over is that what my right honourable friend alludes to is not the primary policy of this government. The policy of the government is to obtain a free trade deal. But he is quite right. In the event that such a thing did not happen, then we would be able to make a good future for Britain without that. It's not the best future, though. It's not the best choice in front of us.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Brussels last week, senior EU officials were very clear with members of the Select Committee that a transitional deal under Article 50 means remaining in the single market, remaining in the customs union and remaining subject to the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice. Isn't it about time the Secretary of State explained that to his backbenchers, so that members such as the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Wood Green can avoid embarrassing themselves in legal matters on the radio? And will he also clarify that parts of the bill, such as Clause 6, will have to go if there's to be a transitional deal?
What I'll say to the Honourable Lady is she makes the mistake that many, I'm afraid, metropolitan media commentators make, which is to assume that everything they're told in Brussels is the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Sir Desmond Swain.
If he were trying to sell me a car, and I assured him that I was determined not to leave the showroom without buying one, does he imagine that that would strengthen my negotiating hand?
He's quite right. It's a foolish proposition, but only enjoyed on the other side of the House.
Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State will wish to join me in congratulating his friends, the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for DEFRA, for the rekindling of their bromance. But I wonder if they understand that the European Parliament has stated clearly that a transition deal can only happen on the basis of existing European Union regulatory, budgetary, supervisory, judiciary, enforcement instruments and structures. Does he believe that those on his benches understand that that will be the basis of the transitional arrangements?
Firstly, let me say to him, a milder version of what I've said to our Scottish Nationalist colleague, that it shouldn't take just what the European Parliament says as the end of the exercise. But of course he's right in one respect, and that is a transition arrangement will look very close, very like what we have now, but it will not be membership, and it will allow us freedoms we don't have now, and that's critical to remember as well.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Speaker, we've always known that the EU is desperate for the UK's money, but it's now become so strapped for cash, it seems, it's now resorted to the sort of diplomacy version of aggressive begging, it seems, over the last few days. So will my right honourable friend assure the House that the government will not be intimidated by the threats and blackmail of the European negotiated team? Because the government will not be forgiven in a time of austerity if it pays more than is legally due for leaving the EU. And would you agree with me on that basis that you don't need to pay £10 billion a year net for a £90 billion trade deficit? You can have one of those for nothing.
On his last point, it's a point I made to one of the member states only last week.
Tom Brake.
Speaker, when I met residents in Fork Hill in South Armagh recently, who were very badly affected during the Troubles, they had no solution to the question of the Northern Ireland border, and nor has anyone else that I have met since. Can the Secretary of State set out how it is possible for us to leave the customs union and for there still to be a frictionless, no-touch, no-control border between Ireland and Northern Ireland?
Well, we published a whole paper on the subject, but there is a whole range of options available to him, to the country, including using trusted trader schemes, using electronic pre-notification, using exemptions for small businesses. There are a whole series of them, which we've talked about at length. You just have to read them.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr. Speaker, may I congratulate the Secretary of State on the progress made in the last couple of weeks, but can I emphasise how important it is that we move on to the next stage in December. Businesses are absolutely really concerned that we have that moving on within the next 2 or 3 weeks. Could he reassure us on that?
Yes, of course, that's what we're aiming to do. One of the points that's become very, very clear in the negotiation is some of the matters like the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland are soluble once we get on to the next stage, but really can't be advanced as we stand now. So for many reasons, both economic and political, we want to make that advance as soon as possible.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State about the arrangements during the 2-year or so implementation period after March 2019, when, of course, the Prime Minister has already told us the writ of the European Court of Justice will continue to run? He told the Select Committee he hoped, subject to a positive Council conclusion in December, the arrangements for the implementation period will be agreed by March 2018. Michel Barnier said the same to the Select Committee last week. Doesn't that put a huge pressure on everybody involved to achieve this successful outcome to the December Council?
Well, I hope so, when he says everybody involved. And indeed, one of the major successes of the October Council was the fact that they told the Commission teams, so-called Task Force 50, to prepare for that, because it's a moderately complex policy that has to be put in place. There are a number of mildly contentious areas of it, and therefore they need to be ready for it. They're underway on that, and if we get the decision in December, then we will deliver, I hope, on what I said to the Select Committee.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Mr. Speaker, did my right honourable friend understand, as I did, the opposition spokesman expressing sympathy for the government's position on the Irish border question, identifying the fact that the success of the Irish Republic in getting the 27 members of the European Union to line up with their position on the customs union has now placed these talks in an impossible position, which, if it's not resolved over the next 2 weeks, may very well see them not going forward, and therefore the need for us to prepare, as our right honourable friend for Dorset West made clear.
Well, I think, to be fair to the Labour spokesman, he was agreeing with the position that the government laid out, and also agreeing that it's an incredibly sensitive issue. So I think he's being very responsible in that respect. So, but of course, my honourable friend is right in one respect, and that is that if we do not deal with this in a way which delivers a free trade, well, starts early, delivers a free trade area, delivers a customs agreement, it will be much, much, much more difficult to resolve the border issue. We still will, but it'll be much more expensive, much more difficult, politically more problematic. But nevertheless, the best way to do it is with fast progress in the next few weeks.
Chris Bryant.
Tens of thousands of businesses in this country, including supermarkets and importers and exporters who work across the whole of the European Union, rely on their ability under EU law to have one certificate of insurance for their lorries, so a lorry can go from Aberystwyth to Krakow or wherever else in the European Union now. They will be securing new insurance certificates soon, which will last for a further year. In other words, by the end of March, they have to know what the situation is going to be for them to be able to take out certificates of insurance for after Brexit, as the Secretary suggests. When will they have that certainty?
Is that very clearly why we're trying to get the implementation period agreed by March?
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement, in particular the fact that there will be a bill in this House. Would he confirm, though, that if this will be based on a treaty that we have signed with 27 other countries, and that whilst we could amend it here, the reality is we cannot force 27 other countries to offer something they're not prepared to offer?
Of course, it would be quite difficult to do that, but what this does is, like any treaty, when it's carried into British law, the ability of the House can amend it, but the House has got to take into account the consequences of so doing.
Angus Brendan McNeill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State said here today that Brexit cannot come at the constitutional or economic integrity of the United Kingdom. Well, we know already that Brexit is indeed costing the economic integrity of the United Kingdom. Yeah. But it does now seem the de facto policy of the United Kingdom government is to partition Ireland, as they cannot leave the single market and especially the customs union without that position. So does he have any idea when the EU 27 might agree to the 2-year extension period, begged for by the Prime Minister in Florence, to delay that position happening, because perversely it may strengthen his pleading for 2 more years to frame the argument like that?
Well, firstly, it's a very strange harm to the integrity of the United Kingdom when we have the highest employment we've ever had in our history and the lowest unemployment in my adult lifetime. As for the question of the transition period, that is not for negotiation. That is to allow both countries, governments, our government, EU governments, but most importantly companies, to be able to accommodate to changes in the knowledge of what the deal is.
Mr. Stephen Crabb.
Speaker, could my right honourable friend say how much detail he expects the deal to include on our future trading relationships with the EU? And does he share the view that was communicated to the committee several times last week in Brussels, that this deal is actually separate to the free trade agreement, which will come later and which will be take longer and be more difficult to agree than this interim deal that we're talking about this afternoon?
Well, I'm afraid I don't agree with Michel Barnier, if that's who said it to the committee. He has, how can I put it, the ambitions of the Commission on this are lower than they should be. The simple truth is nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, and we have to have something which is pretty binding before we're going to sign off the withdrawal agreement.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, and on that note, the Secretary of State in his statement made it clear that the implementation period and the details of it would be part of the legislation. It's absolutely clear, therefore, and perhaps the Secretary of State will confirm this, that there is no guarantee whatsoever that if the trade deal isn't finalised by October next year, this bill will not come before Parliament until after March 2019 and until the trade deal is finalised with the EU.
Well, it can't be brought before Parliament before the withdrawal deal is struck. But I would remind her too that the government has undertaken to provide a vote on the whole deal before we even come to that.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June 2016, the people of this country voted to come out of the EU, end free movement, stop paying the EU billions of pounds, making our own laws in our own countries, judged by our own judges. Is the government going to deliver that by March 2019?
Yes.
Jim Shannon.
Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's comments and statement to the House today that he will not accede to the demands made in the EU league paper that Northern Ireland should stay in the customs union and the single market, considering constitutional and economic implications of such a proposal. So, does the Secretary of State agree that it would be in the interests of the Irish Government not to allow their future relationship with the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to be dictated by EU negotiators who have less interest in the needs of a small country like the Republic of Ireland and indeed the European project?
It's not for me to tell the Irish Government what they should do, but I would say this, that they share with us a determination to maintain no hard border. They obviously have an economic interest in the outcome because we are their biggest trading partner. So they must have a very strong interest in a similar outcome to the one that we are seeking, and I hope they'll reflect that in their conversation with the Commission.
Mr. David Jones.
Commend my right honourable friend on his announcement that the implementation of the withdrawal agreement will be the subject of specific primary legislation. Does this not negate the accusation that the government is intent on bypassing Parliament, and does it not underline the fact that rather the government is intent on restoring our parliamentary sovereignty, which is, after all, the whole purpose of Brexit?
Exactly right. To my count, including bills already passed and bills in prospect, we're now looking at 10 pieces of primary legislation that Parliament can vote on, amend and comment on, of course, as a result of Brexit and in delivering Brexit.
Mike Gapes.
Speaker, the Secretary of State says that any agreement will only hold if Parliament approves it. But he's also said that we won't have any opportunity to vote if we have no agreement. And that means, doesn't it, that all this talk about taking back control and giving our Parliament more powers is absolutely untrue. What we are faced with here is a choice of putting a gun to our own head and blowing it off.
Well, clearly he wasn't listening to my answer to the previous question. In order to deliver Brexit, we are going to, this House is going to deal with at least 10 pieces of primary legislation. That is hardly denying Parliament a say in events.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Secretary of State clarify that if the agreement only happens on the very last day in March, could he explain how, if the bill which is intended to ensure a meaningful vote only comes forward after that date, the vote is in any sense meaningful?
We had a whole urgent question on this, I think, 2 weeks ago now, in which I reiterated to the House the statement of my right honourable friend who's just spoken, the then Minister of State at Dexu, in which he said a meaningful vote is a vote which allows you to say you want the deal or you don't want the deal, and that won't be any different.
Jonathan Edwards.
Transport and logistic experts are warning of the disastrous consequences of a hard border between Wales and the Republic of Ireland would have on the ports of Holyhead, Fishguard and Pembroke Dock. How is he ensuring that the decisions he makes as part of the negotiations don't damage the competitiveness of Welsh ports, which employ thousands of people directly and indirectly?
That is precisely why the primary government policy, the government policy, is to deliver a frictionless trade arrangement between ourselves and the EU27, most importantly of all, I think, the Republic of Ireland.
Mr. Henry Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend correctly and rightly said that he is negotiating with pragmatism. Has he detected any growing pragmatism amongst the unelected EU Commission as they realise, hopefully, that the trade surplus the EU27 have with us would be under threat?
I made an undertaking to the House about a year and a half ago that I would be more polite than they've ever seen me before in my comments on the Commission, and I'll stick to that.
Oh, great. Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State often uses the word creative, be creative, creativity. Could he and his team come up with a more creative approach to settled status? It seems to be upsetting a lot of my constituents who have been
resident for many decades, contributed an enormous amount, and feel that settled status suddenly turns them into a different arrangement. They entered with free movement, they feel they had a different sort of treaty, really, relationship, and now everything, the rug's being pulled. Please could he be creative?
We have been quite creative so far. I mean, those who've been here a long time, many of them are permanent residents already. So one of the things that the Italian government persuaded me was worth doing was ensuring that their transition to the new permanent residents was completely frictionless. It was just a provision of a photograph and a criminality check, no more than that. For those who are still making the application, or will still be making the application, we've given them a 2-year grace period beyond the end of our departure, and we've published a report last week which is designed to show it will be simple, straightforward and very cheap. Those things are designed to make them feel more secure, as I would hope they do, because I have to reiterate, we value the contribution of 3 million Europeans who are in this country today.
William Bragg.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend agree that while the United Kingdom should negotiate on every issue, in order to secure this country's future, to coin a phrase, nothing should be agreed until everything is agreed?
I didn't think I'd ever accuse my honourable friend of sounding like the European Commission, but that is their favourite phrase, and it's one I stick by too.
Clyde Efford.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker, to your contribution to my fitness regime. Can the Secretary of State just explain, if this House amends this primary legislation that he's going to bring before us in the Withdrawal and Agreement Implementation Bill, in relation to the agreement, how will he convey that to the European Union if we've retained sovereignty?
Yes.
I'm not going to comment on his fitness regime. It's too far away for me to tell. But if the House does that, then that will be taken, I guess, by the government as an instruction to go back and speak to them. Whether that will deliver any outcome, I don't know.
Michael Tomlinson.
I warmly welcome the Secretary of State's statement, and in particular his confirmation from the dispatch box that there will be a separate piece of legislation, the Agreement and Implementation Bill. Does he agree with me two things? Firstly, that this means any amendment in the committee stage starting tomorrow to that effect will be unnecessary, and secondly, that this will ensure that there will be both a meaningful vote, but one that doesn't undermine our negotiating?
On the latter point, yes, he's right. On the former point, there may well be some minor consequential changes, but not major ones, I would think.
Simon Clarke.
Thank you, Speaker. Regarding the financial settlement, which will eventually need to be worked out, does my right honourable friend agree with me that whilst the British public would look favourably upon a settlement in the context of a comprehensive and ambitious free trade deal, there would be genuine reluctance to make such a payment in the event that we've been left with nothing by the EU?
Yeah.
I feel tempted to employ my honourable friend as a negotiator, because that's exactly what I've been saying to the Europeans for some time.
Suella Fernandez.
Welcome my right honourable friend's announcement that there will be a bill on the withdrawal agreement and implementation which will enable vital parliamentary scrutiny. Does he agree with me that whilst parliamentary involvement is essential, this is not and never should be construed as an opportunity to reverse Brexit, to return the UK to the EU, or go behind the wishes of the British people as expressed in last year's referendum?
Indeed.
My friend is entirely right. It's a meaningful vote, but not meaningful in the sense that some believe meaningful, which is that you can reverse the whole decision. That's not available to us.
Craig McKinley.
I too met Mr Barnier in Brussels last week, and I'm sorry if I left him for the Secretary of State in anything like a bad mood. But whilst I perceive my right honourable friend's approach to be fair, reasonable and giving ground where necessary, it is feeling a little bit like a one-way street. Does my right honourable friend share my view that their unreasonable intransigence is becoming wearing on him as it is for the British electorate?
I'm paid to put up with being worn down occasionally, but no, I won't. I wouldn't say that. My relationships with Mr Barnier have been nothing other than cordial. Of course, this is a tough negotiation, and it may well get tougher yet.
Robert Jenrick.
primary value of a transitional period is to give British businesses the time to adapt to new arrangements. It's not to have an extension of the talks, because that merely increases uncertainty and is an appalling negotiating tactic. Would the Secretary of State take this opportunity to reassure us that his intention is to agree in a deal of such specificity that our businesses will know the nature of future arrangements prior to the point of departure?
My honourable friend goes right to the point. There are three reasons for the transition. One is for the British government to be able to accommodate. One is for foreign governments to accommodate. But as he said, the most important is to allow British businesses to accommodate in the knowledge of what they're accommodating to.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, every individual and organisation the Select Committee saw in Brussels and Paris last week stressed that their absolute priority is people and citizens' rights. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that when an agreement on citizens' rights is reached, this should be announced, committed to in perpetuity by both sides in order to help 4.5 million citizens get on with their lives, and that not to do so would raise the question, who is really putting people first?
He makes a very good point. Sadly, I'll say to him that this phrase used earlier by our honourable friend, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed, is the primary maxim of the European Commission.
Richard Drax.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that uncertainty is the weapon of the EU Commissioner and the Remainer? And can I urge him to stiffen his resolve to ensure that the will of the British people is kept?
He's, of course, exactly right. We see, how can I put it, time pressure being played against us all the time, and it's something we have to resist properly.
Wendy Morton.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for his statement today, and in particular the way he continues to update the House as we move towards delivering the will of the British people on June the 23rd. With regard to trade, which is really, really important, would he agree that both sides have got a huge amount to gain from free trade with the absolute minimum of friction?
Yes, she's exactly right. Properly seen, this is a positive-sum game, a positive-sum negotiation. It's only if you're unwise and don't take the point on free trade that it becomes a negative-sum one.
Mr. Speaker, there's been much complaint from the benches opposite against the government's very generous offer of a meaningful vote on whatever deal the Secretary of State is able to achieve. But can he confirm that that is exactly the basis that the European Parliament will vote on whatever deal he's able to achieve? And can he tell the House whether UK members of the European Parliament will be voting on that deal?
Well, the ones in receipt of the Conservative whip will be.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State and to all colleagues. In a moment, I shall call Dame